Stop it. Stop writing your comments. I can see you writing a comment. Stop it, and just hear me out of this one, okay? I swear to God, if I see you comment something like, I didn't even need to watch the video to know that it's wrong, I will block you from ever being able to comment on this channel again. Do not test me on this. Anyway, let's get on to the video. This video contains minor spoilers for Act 1 of Baldur's Gate 3, and very minor spoilers for Disco Elysium. Hi, I'm Transtina, and I want to talk about Baldur's Gate 3. For those of you that have apparently been living under a whole-ass boulder, Baldur's Gate 3 is a role-playing game developed by Larian Studios as a sequel to the Baldur's Gate series, which previously consisted of Baldur's Gate, released in 1998, Baldur's Gate 2, released in 2000, and those games' expansion packs, all of which were developed by BioWare. The series also had some spin-offs, but to be totally honest, I don't care about those. Baldur's Gate 3 had an early access release in 2020 and a full release in 2023, at which point it received a lot of Game of the Year awards. Now, to start by laying my cards on the table, I think that Baldur's Gate 3 is a fantastic game that fully deserves all of the Game of the Year awards that it got, and it easily counts as one of my favorite games of all time. That being said, it is not a perfect game, and the ways it is not perfect are interesting to me. In particular, I think the flaws with Baldur's Gate 3 do not come from any major failure in execution, but rather from overarching design goals which are, in my opinion, misguided. So let's get started by talking about those design goals. Section 1. Replicating the mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Yep, we're starting with one of the big ones. I think it's pretty obvious that one of the main goals of Baldur's Gate 3 was to replicate the experience of playing Dungeons & Dragons within a video game. This is an understandable goal. It is a Dungeons & Dragons video game after all. However, I don't think that the tabletop RPG experience translates as cleanly to video games as we often assume. To see this, let's talk about dice. In Dungeons & Dragons, and many other TTRPGs, players often have to perform skill checks, which involve them rolling a die and adding the value of the skill relevant to whatever task they are trying to do. If the result is high enough, they succeed. Otherwise, they fail. For example, if a character wants to climb up a wall, the player controlling that character might roll a 20-sided die and add the value of their athletic skill to the result. Simple, right? Baldur's Gate 3 adapts this mechanic exactly. The player is often asked to roll a virtual die, and the value of their character's skills are added to the result to determine if they succeed or fail. It is certainly not the only game to do this, but it is a little bit unique in that it represents the random number as the roll of a virtual die, rather than just leaving the random number stuff in the background, a la Fallout 3. The only other game I can think of, at least off the top of my head, that does this is Disco Elysium, and let's just put a pin in that comparison for a moment. In any case, using randomness for skill checks is a mechanic that video games often borrow from TTRPGs, but, to be blunt, I think that this choice is often a mistake, and I think that it is definitely a mistake for Baldur's Gate 3. To illustrate this, let's consider something that happened during my first playthrough. I had encountered a group of NPCs that I had a tense relationship with, and initiated a conversation with them. To try to avoid confrontation, I chose to lie. However, I failed the deception check, and a fight broke out, in which I got my ass soundly handed to me, and my party was defeated. Upon reloading, I spent a while preparing to try the fight again, equipping my characters with better gear, buying potions, etc., and returned to the group of NPCs, at which point I chose the same dialogue option and again lied about my intentions. However, this time, I succeeded the deception check, and the NPCs moved on without giving me trouble. And that is a bit anticlimactic, isn't it? So, what's going on here? Well, though I am not doing it intentionally, I am accidentally save scumming. For the uninitiated, save scumming is the process of repeatedly reloading a saved game until a random chance goes the way that you want it to, or at least that's the definition that I'll use in this video. Now, if you save scum intentionally, you are the lowest form of human garbage. I'm just kidding. Of course you can play your games however you want to. Can we agree, though, that save scumming kind of sucks? Save scumming doesn't feel good to do, at least for me, and I cannot imagine that I'm the only one. Because of that, my general opinion is that, as a game designer, if you find that a system you've created allows players to save scum, You should at least reevaluate the system and see if you really need it to be that way. For a contrasting example, let's take out our pin and talk about Disco Elysium. It is possible to save scum in Disco Elysium, as skill checks there also use random dice rolls. However, I don't think it would be worth it to remove the dice from Disco Elysium. This was definitely one of my biggest complaints when I was first playing Disco Elysium. It seemed like it would be very easy to remove the dice and create a more predictable experience, similar to the change in the way skill checks work between Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas. And yes, I am using Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas as my examples because I really like the H-Bomber Guide videos about those games, and if you haven't seen them, you should watch them. They're good. Anyway, the key point that I did not understand at the time is that Disco Elysium is a game about regret. It features a protagonist who deeply regrets his own past. Yes, I did get the Sorry Cop achievement extremely early, why do you ask? And a setting that cannot escape its own past, constantly trapped in the echoes of a failed communist revolution that is drowning in this feeling that things were not supposed to go this way. So the dice work to add to this theme. Sometimes things go wrong, sometimes you fail, even when you didn't do anything wrong, and sometimes when you did. But the core message of the game is that we need to get back up and face forwards rather than backwards. We cannot become better people or build a better society if we are trapped in the past. The mechanics of the game force you, the player, to learn this in a visceral, emotional way, rather than just in an abstract way like you would get if you read it in a book or heard it in a video essay. Baldur's Gate 3, on the other hand, does not have a theme like this that is reinforced by the dice mechanic, so the game is only impacted negatively. Section 2. Fidelity and Realism. I know it feels weird to complain about realism in a fantasy game, but hopefully it will make sense soon. Fiction is at its best when it convinces us to suspend our disbelief and believe that the fictional worlds we are viewing are real places. This is a good goal. I think art should try to make us forget that it is constructed, at least in most cases, but some of the natural instincts for executing this can lead you astray. Baldur's Gate 3 attempts visual fidelity. The goal is that everything in the game world should be presented, visually, with complete accuracy to the player. In case that sounds a little weird, the way I think about this is that there is a completely imaginary space in which the game is actually taking place. Then there is the representation of that space that is shown to the player. This representation can never be fully accurate to the imaginary game space, and in fact there can often be significant simplifications made when the representation is constructed. However, many games have the goal of getting the representation to be as close as possible to the imaginary game space. This is not necessarily a bad goal to strive for. Baldur's Gate 3 does, indeed, look gorgeous, and I doubt games will ever stop striving for this goal, but the pursuit of this goal can lead to some issues elsewhere, which is exactly what happens in the case of Baldur's Gate 3. In particular, it can be incredibly frustrating to control the game. Like, have you ever tried to move your character while the camera is looking through a door, so you can only select the door, because for some reason clicking on the space where the open door used to be counts as clicking on the door, so you have to fight with the camera to actually select the space you want? I'm sure it's possible to fix this, but it seems to me that this problem is only present to begin with because of the fully movable 3D camera, and the only reason that there is a fully movable 3D camera is to show off the gorgeous, intricately modeled environments that the artists at Larian must have spent a truly mind-boggling amount of time on. And, to repeat myself, the environments are beautiful, and must have taken an incredible amount of time, care, and labor to create, but every design decision will have its consequences. But anyway, for another example, have you ever tried to pick up a small item that is inside a slightly bigger item, so you have to fight with the game to select the small item and not the large one? Let's put a pin in that actually. We will talk more about the items shortly. And how about the combat? All of these problems get even worse in combat. It can be so goddamned hard to figure out which enemies are in range of your character's attacks, and even harder to figure out where they would have to move to target enemies that are not in range, since the system that is supposed to show you this does not always work. Also, the selecting things issue gets much worse in combat, since the stakes are a little higher. If the party is fighting for their lives, most members either down or close to going down, I do not want my party's wizard, for example, to dramatically launch a firebolt at a door rather than the powerful enemies standing right next to it. This did actually happen to me early in my playthrough, by the way. These are all problems that can be solved and have been solved in other games. However, from a purely visual point of view, introducing the UI elements necessary to address these issues can be viewed as cluttering the visuals and obscuring the world. The thinking goes that this causes the world to feel less real, since these visual elements highlight the artificiality of the world. This makes sense from a purely visual point of view, but video games are not a purely visual medium, and this can end up having the opposite effect of making the world feel less real, as it introduces barriers between the player and the avatars they are controlling. Now, to be clear, friction in a game's controls is not inherently a bad thing. There are certainly cases where choosing style over usability is absolutely the right call. I have not played it myself, but I've heard that The Last Guardian is an excellent example of this, where the imprecision in the controls serves to highlight the fact that the bird, dog, thing is its own creature, so this friction heightens the sense that it is a real being. However, Baldur's Gate 3 is not The Last Guardian, and these difficulties only serve to detract from the experience, rather than enhance it. Section 3. Multiplayer. I guess I should start by clarifying that I don't actually have a problem with there being multiplayer in Baldur's Gate 3. What I do have a problem with is the idea that the game should function in exactly the same way in single player and in multiplayer, but that would be a less snappy section title. Anyway, in a vacuum, this sounds like a good design goal, but I find that it ends up causing some problems. Baldur's Gate 3, much like D&D and many other TTRPGs, has 3 distinct modes of play: exploration, conversation, and combat, and these modes function in fundamentally different ways. These are implemented in a fairly standard way in Baldur's Gate 3. The exploration mode functions as the default mode, and the game switches into combat mode when a fight starts and conversation mode if the player starts talking to an NPC. In multiplayer, however, there is the possibility that different players can be in different modes of play at the same time. Baldur's Gate 3 handles this in a relatively clean way. The exploration mode is completely persistent, and the conversation and combat modes exist as bubbles within the exploration mode. So, if one player is in a conversation and another is exploring, they can talk to the NPC to be added to the conversation. Similarly, if one player is in a fight, another player will be automatically switched into combat mode if they enter the area that the fight is taking place in. Overall, I think this is a good solution to the problem, although it admittedly does produce a little jank. I think we have all heard jokes about how weird it is that, in turn-based games, characters just kind of stand around and wait to be bonked on the head until it is their turn to go and bonk the other guy in the head. And like, come on guys, I think we can suspend our disbelief at least that far. In Baldur's Gate 3 though, this is kind of true, since characters outside the combat bubble will continue acting as normal, even though some of the characters in the bubble will be still and not doing anything unless it is their turn. This isn't a major criticism, it's just a little weird feeling. But as I said before, I think that this is a pretty good solution to this problem. My issue, then, is the fact that these behaviors still happen in single player. To illustrate the issue, let's take another example that happened during my first playthrough. I was in the goblin camp in the first area when I got the indication that one of my party members wanted to talk to me. Foolishly, I decided to talk to them, as this was how I was trained to handle this situation in any other RPG. This resulted in one of my companions dramatically telling me their tragic backstory, while 2 background NPCs were talking over them, repeating the same handful of idle dialogue lines, which, needless to say, was not the most impactful way to experience this scene. I really do not think this would be a difficult thing to avoid. Most other single-player RPGs freeze the rest of the world while a conversation is taking place, and it would make sense to me to make that the behavior while playing in single player. Alternatively, it also would have made sense to me to mute the background dialogue while in a conversation and have it only play for players in exploration mode. This would also address this issue in multiplayer, though, as I said before, I am more forgiving of this happening in multiplayer as a compromise was definitely necessary. With these 3 design goals introduced, I think it's time to talk about what is probably my biggest issue with Baldur's Gate 3, as it is tied into all of these design goals. My biggest issue with Baldur's Gate 3 is the goddamn inventory system. Section 4. The goddamn inventory system. Alright, it's time to pull out our pen and talk about the items. This is pretty subjective, so your mileage on this may vary, but I find that there's just way too much stuff in Baldur's Gate 3. I don't really think that every sword, club, bow, every goddamn cup needs to be an interactable inventory item. I really do get what the idea here was, and I think that it worked for some people, but I'm definitely not one of those people. I think that this decision partially comes from the desire for fidelity. It doesn't feel realistic if you kill an enemy who is fighting you with a sword and you go to loot them and they aren't carrying a sword, or any other object that feels like it should exist doesn't actually exist within the game world. As with turn-based battles though, I think that we as players should really be able to suspend our disbelief far enough to handle this, as this is usually a trade-off for improved player experience. The other part of the motivation for this decision, I think, comes from the desire to replicate the mechanics of D&D, as, theoretically, every object is interactable in D&D. However, practically speaking, players in TTRPGs quickly learned that there is no point in interacting with everything. It is not feasible, for example, to make a non-negligible amount of money by collecting the weapons of slain enemies and carrying them to a trader to sell. This is not the case in Baldur's Gate 3, though. It is entirely feasible to take the weapons of all the enemies you defeat and sell them, which can get you a decent amount of gold. So there's definitely an incentive to click the big Take All button when looting a body and just filling your inventory up with garbage. Now, you might say, just don't take the things you don't need. And yeah, I suppose that's fair, but 1, it is so much easier to just click Take All, and 2, I want to make sure that I don't miss any of the actual valuable loot, and it is much harder to be meticulous in my looting if I'm leaving stuff on the ground. And yeah, there's the star thingy that disappears after you loot something, but I have definitely had that star not show up when I hadn't looted something, so I tend to be a little distrustful of that. The bottom line, though, is that this causes a non-trivial portion of the game to end up being managing your inventory and deciding which things you want to take with you, which things you want to leave on the ground, and which things you want to leave in your camp stash, which, I think it's fair to say, is the least fun part of the game. All of that being said, though, I should also say that making as much of the world interactable as possible is a good goal that does add a lot to the game. It feels great to realize you can break a bridge that an enemy is standing on so they plummet into the chasm below without you actually having to fight them. It feels very immersive sim-y. So, I don't want all of this to disappear, I just wish there was more of a middle ground that kept the cool stuff while getting rid of the boring busy work. My other main problem with the inventory system is actually something that has been changed since the game was released, but I had to suffer with it, so, by the goddess, I will be talking about it here. The problem is that you used to only be able to access a character's inventory if they were actively in your party. In particular, even when you were at camp, you were not able to access a character's inventory if they were at camp with you, but not in your party. In case this doesn't sound like a big deal, let me tell you another story from my first playthrough. So, for context, there's a quest in the first act that asks you to find a piece of infernal iron. While exploring on my own, I came across a locked chest, so I had the party rogue unlock it and take all the items inside. One of these items was a piece of infernal iron. The snag, though, is that I had not received the quest to find infernal iron at that point. Not realizing that this item was required for a quest, I didn't take any notice of it. So, later on, I decided to leave the rogue at camp and bring a different companion with me, because the companions are all really good and I want all of them in my party at the same time, leaving the infernal iron at camp with him. Later still, I received the quest to find a piece of infernal iron, and the quest log helpfully informed me that I already had one, and should give it to the person who had given me the quest. So I tried to turn in the quest, and the quest giver informed me that I did not, in fact, have a piece of infernal iron. Checking my inventory, I realized that he was right, and became very confused. My first thought was that the quest log had made a mistake, and that I did not have infernal iron yet, so I looked up where the infernal iron was, and I saw a very familiar locked chest. Now, I don't usually look things like this up, I just really wanted to figure out what was going on here. But anyway, this just made me even more confused. So I returned to the locked chest and confirmed that, yes, I had taken everything out of it. Next, I think that maybe I had accidentally sold it, since you pick up a lot of items that don't have much use beyond being sold, and since I had not realized at this point that it was an important quest item. So I revisited all the merchants that I had talked to and checked if it was in their inventories. It was not. Finally, it dawns on me that it was probably in the inventories of one of my party members back at camp. So, I return to camp and swap each party member back into my party, because that's the only way I can check what they're holding, and finally find the infernal iron. This whole process took me around half an hour, which is kind of an absurd amount of time to spend on a quest that I had, by all rights, already completed. So, while not game-breaking, this was very annoying, and it wasted my time, especially since this kind of situation could have been designed around by having one inventory for the entire party, like most other RPGs do. I mean, KOTOR does that, and that game came out when there were dinosaurs roaming the earth. The only reason I can see for not making the inventory system work this way is the multiplayer, as this would mean that all the players would have the same shared inventory, which could work, but would probably feel very weird. The next solution, the one that the game went with, was to have each character, including companions, have their own independent inventory so that the companions kind of feel like player characters that don't have a separate player to control them, so you have to tell them what to do. This is a relatively reasonable solution, but the fact that the game didn't allow you to access a companion's inventory unless they were in the party made it significantly less usable than it otherwise would be, and than it is now. That aside, this is still a bit of a clunky system, compared to having one shared inventory for the whole party, and the only reason I can imagine for why it is this way is that the game was supposed to function in exactly the same way in single player and in multiplayer. Conclusion. I want to reiterate at this point that none of these issues ruin Baldur's Gate 3. As I said at the start, I absolutely love it. It is one of my favorite games of all time. Part of the reason why I chose to talk about it is that it is so good outside of all these issues that the problems that I have with it are instructive. On that note, if anyone has commented something to the effect of, "But lots of games do that, Baldur's Gate 3 isn't unique," everyone else gets to point and laugh at you for commenting without watching the whole video, because that's actually my whole point. So, yes, most of the problems that I mentioned are not unique. In particular, many, if not most RPGs have issues like the ones I described for Baldur's Gate 3, though the multiplayer stuff is pretty unique to Larian Studios games. RPGs are probably my favorite genre, but these aspects are prevalent throughout, and they can really detract from some otherwise great experiences. Games that I absolutely adore, like, yes, Baldur's Gate 3, Disco Elysium, and Fallout New Vegas, can be held back by following these flawed but standard design decisions. As I said, I think that the dice mechanics in Disco Elysium are good, but it absolutely has a problem with inventory garbage that can really drag down the pace of an already slow and thoughtful game. Fallout New Vegas avoids the skill checks problem, outside of combat, but that isn't too much of a problem, but it absolutely tries to be overly realistic and adds mountains of items that are not necessary. You can't even ignore all the copies of guns, since you need to use copies of guns to repair guns that break, even if you ignore all the pointless items like fans and whatnot. Some might argue that this is because the game is about scavenging to survive, but I think that this perhaps goes a little far in that regard. I actually think that the food mechanics in Baldur's Gate 3 do this job really well, since I can just scavenge for whatever food I find around the world, and I don't have to ever worry about it again. It is hidden in my inventory, and I can auto-select what food I will use to rest with. Anyway, this has been a bit of a tangent. My point is that I absolutely love RPGs, but I want them to be better, and sometimes improving a genre comes from looking at the genre conventions and asking why those are the conventions, and if we can replace them with something better. Thanks for watching. Hey, thanks for watching all the way to the end, unless you just skipped to the end, but I'm not really sure why you would do that. Anyway, I wanted to give a huge thank you to my friend Alex for making the Tina avatar that I used in this video. I also wanted to shout out the Baldur's Gate 3 wiki and Disco Elysium wiki because I took a few images from there. I also took a few images from other places. I tried to make sure they were all Creative Commons, but I might have missed some, so if you notice I'm using someone's image without attribution, please do let me know, and also please don't sue me. Lastly, if you liked the video, stay tuned, because there should be more coming soon. Thanks, bye!